Let's take a look at chapter 23. On my version of the slide, it looks like it's all kind of clumped together because of the format that I'm using to record in. I hope it does not look that way for you. Your first slide always is chronology, and I want to point out to you, we're talking about World War, and this timeline really shows that. We're talking about Sarajevo, we're talking about the German U-boat and it sinking the Lusitania, we're talking about Mexico, New Mexico, we're talking about Germany and France. I mean, just all over the place. We really are talking about World War at this point. It's important to get an idea of where we're starting, though, since we're talking specifically about U.S. history here. At the time, around 1910, when the Mexican Revolution began, the United States, because of its proximity to Mexico, obviously was concerned. And we had a series of battles that were fought along the border, and that is actually known as the Mexican Border War. And these were fought in Texas and along the border. So the United States Army was stationed in force along the border and on several occasions fought with Mexican rebels or federals. The height of this conflict, though, came in 1916 when Revolutionary Pancho Villa attacked the American border town of Columbus, New Mexico. In response, the United States Army, under the direction of General John Pershing, launched an expedition into northern Mexico to find and capture Villa. So the operation was a failure in that the fact that Villa was not captured, but it was particularly successful in that the army did find and engage rebels, and they did kill his top two lieutenants. The revolutionary himself escaped, and the American army returned to the U.S. in January of 1917. Even though the military returned to the U.S., the conflict at the border continued, and the U.S. continued to launch several smaller operations into Mexican territory until after the American victory in the Battle of Ambos Nogales, which led to the establishment of a permanent border wall. So this is Pancho Villa, the man that we were just talking about, the Mexican rebel, initially supported by Wilson, but then he turned away from him, turned his support away, and so Villa retaliated by attacking the United States. It was really difficult for Wilson at this time because he wanted to set the U.S. on this course of moral leadership, and he wanted to fight to protect the country. He also wanted to show how important peace was. So we see Wilson struggle with that as the First World War gets started. Here's an editorial cartoon that pictures Woodrow Wilson as a school teacher. So Wilson was the son of a minister and had worked in higher education as president of Princeton University. So he was associated with teaching and preaching. And as the United States president, he continued to do that, to lecture and preach. So here in this editorial cartoon that ran in an old newspaper, you can see that he is instructing these little students. And you can see that they are Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And he's telling them we can have no sympathy with those who seek to seize the power of government to advance their own personal interest or ambition. It's like he's pointing it out to them, like maybe they're too young to understand that themselves or too naive to understand that themselves. It shows that the U.S., as president, he is putting the U.S. into this role as a moral guide. And another thing that's leading up to war, the torpedoing and sinking of the Lusitania, just depicted in the English drawing here, resulted in the death of more than 1,200 civilians and was an international incident that shifted American sentiment as to their potential role in the war, and as illustrated here in this British recruiting poster. Remember the Lusitania, it's your duty, enlist today. So that was a big international event that's going to lead us to consider war. So Wilson did not want war. He had no desire to embroil the United States in a bloody and lengthy war that he could see was devastating Europe. His foreign policy through his first term and through his campaign for re-election focused on keeping the United States out of war and involving the country in international affairs only when there was a moral imperative to do so. After his 1916 re-election, however, the free trade associated with neutrality proved to be impossible to secure against the total war strategies of the belligerents, particularly Germany's submarine warfare. Ethnic ties to Europe meant that much of the general public was more than happy to remain neutral. Wilson's reluctance to go to war was mirrored in Congress. And we can see that on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson actually finally asked Congress to declare war. The Senate approved 82-6 on April 4th. The House of Representatives approved 2 days later with a vote of 373-50. So you can see it wasn't exactly a unanimous decision to go to war. In December 1917, Wilson requested war against Austria-Hungary, and at that point it was unanimous by the Senate and almost unanimous by the House of Representatives, who voted 350-1. So there were a lot of young men in the United States who were eager to join the war effort, but there were just as many who did not want to join, maybe because of a moral objection or simply because they didn't want to fight in a war that seemed so far away from American interest. Wilson might have entered the war unwillingly, but once it became inevitable, he quickly moved to use federal legislation and government oversight to put into place the conditions for the nation's success. First, he sought to ensure that all logistical needs, from fighting men to raw materials for wartime production, were in place and within government reach. From legislating rail service to encouraging Americans to buy Liberty loans and to bring the boys home sooner, the government worked to make sure that the conditions for success were in place. Then came the more nuanced challenge of ensuring that a country of immigrants from both sides of the conflict fell in line as Americans first and foremost. There were aggressive propaganda campaigns combined with the series of restrictive laws to silence dissenters to ensure Americans would either support the war or at least stay silent. While some conscientious objectors and others spoke out, the government efforts were largely successful in silencing those who had favored neutrality. And so I just mentioned propaganda campaigns. So these posters illustrate the pressure exerted on immigrants to quell any dissent that they might feel about the U.S. at war. Here's, food will win the war, wheat is needed for the Allies, waste nothing. And you can see it's also printed. This is a poster of Lady Liberty, who is imploring you to be patriotic and to save food. Another way that propaganda was used, not only to gain support and to unite the U.S., but to show, to villainize the people who were opposing us in war. Specifically here, The Temptation, which appeared in the Dallas Morning News in 1917, shows Germany as the devil, tempting Mexico to join the war effort against the United States in exchange for the return of land that formerly belonged to Mexico. The prospect of such a move made it all but impossible for Wilson to avoid war. And this is propaganda against Germany. This poster depicts Germans as brutal apes stepping on the nation's shores with their crude, blunt weapon of culture. And we've talked before about Volkisch thought and about how nationalism ties people together based on culture and excludes other people who are not of that culture. So this really depicts that. The First World War remade the world for all Americans, whether they served abroad or stayed at home. For some groups, such as women and African Americans, the war provided opportunities for advancement. As the soldiers went to war, women and African Americans took on jobs that had previously been reserved for white men. In return for a no-strike pledge, workers gained the right to organize. Many of these shifts were temporary, however, and the end of the war came with the cultural expectation that the old social order would be reinstated. Some reform efforts also proved short-lived. President Wilson's wartime agencies managed the wartime economy effectively, but closed immediately at the end of the war, although they reappeared for a little while later with the New Deal. While patriotic fervor allowed progressives to pass prohibition, the strong demand for alcohol made the law unsustainable. Women's suffrage, however, the right to vote, was a progressive movement that came to fruition in part because of the circumstances of the war, and unlike prohibition, it did remain. And, I just mentioned that part of the conditions of women and African Americans going to war during or going to work during the First World War depended on them signing a pledge for no strikes. And that's because labor strikes, were considered by some Americans to be the first step on the path that led ultimately to the Bolshevik revolutions and to chaos. And this political cartoon depicts that fear. African American soldiers suffered under segregation and second-class treatment in the military at this time. Still, the 369th Infantry earned recognition and reward for its valor in service in both France and the United States. The war brought new opportunities for women, such as training offered to those who joined the Land Army or the opening up of traditional male occupations. In 1918, Eva Abbott, in picture B, was one of the many new women workers on the Erie Railroad. However, once the war ended and the veterans returned home, these opportunities largely disappeared. Something interesting about World War I is that it's the first time we start to see photographs from the war. The U.S. soldiers run past fallen Germans on their way to a bunker in this picture. And because we have these pictures now, it really brings war closer to home. And people get an understanding more and more about what the soldiers were going through. American involvement in World War I came late. Compared to the incredible carnage endured by Europe, the United States battles were brief and successful, although the appalling fighting conditions and significant casualties made it feel otherwise to the Americans, both at war and at home. For Wilson, victory in the fields of France was not followed by triumphs in Versailles or Washington, D.C., where his vision of a new world order was summarily rejected by his Allied counterparts and then even by the U.S. Congress. Wilson had hoped that America's political influence would steer the world to a place of more open and tempered international negotiations. His influence did lead to the creation of the League of Nations, but concerns at home impeded the process so completely that the U.S. never signed the treaty that Wilson worked so hard to create. Also for Wilson, the end of World War I did not bring about the celebration that Wilson had hoped. The flu pandemic of 1918, commonly called the Spanish flu at that time, swept across the United States, resulting in overcrowded flu wards like this one and leading to other trauma onto post-war psyche. Also post-war, riots broke out in Chicago in the wake of the stoning of a young black boy. After 2 weeks, 38 more people had died. Some were stoned, many had to abandon their vandalized homes. So in addition to economic problems, Spanish flu, racial tensions are running high at this time. Additionally, Americans were tired of the progressive movement, and they made it clear that they were seeking a break from the harsh realities that the country had been forced to face through the previous years of progressive mandates and war. They voted in Warren G. Harding in a landslide election. Americans indicated through their vote their desire for a government that would leave them alone, keep taxes low, and limit social progressivism and international intervention. Basically, after war and after this period of progressivism, the American voting public wanted someone more conservative, and that's what they found in Warren G. Harding. The Paris Peace Conference ended World War I with the Treaty at Versailles. The conference held the largest number of world leaders in one place to date. Now, in this photograph, we only see four. We see Prime Minister George of Great Britain, we see Orlando of Italy, we see Clemenceau of France, and of course, President Wilson from the United States. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 23. You're always welcome to go back and view the notes as many times as you'd like. I'm also attaching a PDF of just the notes without the recording for your convenience as well. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop me an email and I will get back with you as soon as possible.